Dawn broke over the mountains of northern Luzon, and Emiko Hayashi believed she had 6 minutes left to live. The 2 American soldiers said nothing as they escorted her across the compound. Their boots crunched on gravel. Her bare feet made no sound. She had prepared herself for this moment during 6 days of captivity, repeating the words her father once told her about facing death with dignity. But now, walking toward what she assumed would be her execution, her hands trembled despite every effort to still them. August 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, and Emiko, a 28-year-old civilian nurse who had served with Imperial Japanese medical units in the Philippines, was certain that surrender meant nothing for women like her, collaborators, traitors to whatever new order would emerge from the ashes. She had heard the stories, the whispered warnings from Major Hideki Kobayashi before the Americans came. They will show no mercy to those who aided the Emperor's forces. They will make examples. The compound was silent, except for the morning birds and the rhythmic footsteps of her escorts. Behind her, in the converted warehouse where 15 Japanese women huddled together on rice mats, Yuki Sakamoto was probably crying. Haruko Matsuda, the eldest among them, would be praying. They all knew what this summons meant. When soldiers came at dawn to separate one prisoner from the others, it was never for a pleasant reason. Emiko had been captured 3 weeks earlier when American forces overran the field hospital near Tuguegarao. She wasn't military. She wore no uniform, carried no weapon, but she had treated wounded Japanese soldiers, had served the imperial cause with her skills as a nurse, and in the chaos of war's end, such distinctions felt meaningless. The Americans had rounded up everyone associated with Japanese forces, soldiers, civilians, men, women, the wounded, and the whole. They separated them into groups, processed them with bureaucratic efficiency, and provided no information about what would happen next. The first days were the worst. Emiko and her fellow nurses expected immediate retribution. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that they viewed Asian people as subhuman, that surrender meant torture and degradation. Major Kobayashi had been explicit in his final briefing before disappearing into the jungle. "If the Americans capture you," he said, "expect no mercy. They will do to you what their propaganda cannot admit." But the Americans didn't torture them. They didn't abuse them. They didn't even speak harshly. Instead, they provided thin mattresses, basic rations, and medical attention for those who needed it. Guards stood watch but maintained professional distance. An interpreter, a Japanese-American corporal whose presence confused and disturbed Emiko in equal measure, explained the rules in flawless Japanese. "You will be processed as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will be safe." Safe. The word felt like a lie. How could they be safe? Japan had lost. The Emperor had surrendered. The radio broadcast that filtered through the camp spoke of atomic bombs, of cities vaporized, of a homeland that no longer existed as she remembered it. What use did victors have for enemy nurses except as examples of what happens to those who resist American power? So when the soldiers came for her at dawn on the 6th day, Emiko assumed the pretense had ended. Whatever game the Americans were playing, whatever temporary mercy they had shown, was finished. Now came the real consequences. The 2 soldiers flanking her were young, perhaps her age or younger. Both were black, which had startled her initially. The propaganda had never mentioned that America's army included African soldiers. She had been taught to view all Americans as white demons, but here were men whose skin was darker than her own, wearing the same uniform, carrying the same rifles, enforcing the same inscrutable rules. One of them, tall, with a thin mustache, had kind eyes. The other kept his gaze forward, professional and unreadable. They led her past the main buildings of the compound, past the administrative offices where she had been photographed and fingerprinted like a criminal, past the medical tent where an American doctor had checked her for disease with detached efficiency. She tried to memorize details, the way condemned prisoners supposedly did. A broken wagon wheel leaning against a fence, laundry hanging on a line, somehow absurdly domestic in this place of captivity. A flowering vine climbing the corner of a storage shed, red blossoms open to catch the morning light. Her father used to grow flowers in their small garden in Yokohama. Before the war consumed everything, before she volunteered for nursing service, before the world divided into enemies and allies and left no room for flowers. She wondered if that garden still existed, or if American bombs had turned it to ash like so much else. The soldiers stopped at a wooden gate. Beyond it lay a small courtyard, shaded by a large acacia tree. Emiko's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was where they would do it. A discreet location, away from the other prisoners, where a single gunshot wouldn't cause panic. She drew a deep breath, straightened her spine, and prepared to face death the way a daughter of Japan should, with dignity, with silence, with acceptance of fate. The tall soldier with kind eyes opened the gate. The other gestured for her to enter. She stepped through, and her entire understanding of the moment shattered. There was no firing squad, no assembled officers with grim faces, no pit freshly dug to receive her body. Instead, beneath the acacia tree, someone had arranged a crude table from wooden planks and crates. On the table sat metal cups releasing steam into the cool morning air, bowls with white rice still steaming, and a plate of sliced tropical fruits, papaya, mango, something she didn't recognize. The simple domesticity of it created a cognitive dissonance so profound that Emiko stopped walking, her mind struggling to reconcile expectation with reality. A third soldier stood beside the table, also black, also young, with nervous energy in his posture. When he saw her, he smiled, actually smiled, and gestured toward the table with both hands in a manner that struck her as deliberately respectful, almost Japanese in its formality. Private First Class James Washington had been awake since 4 a.m, preparing for this moment. He had volunteered for this duty when Sergeant Eugene Carter asked who wanted to help with the civilian prisoner feeding program. Most of the other guys in his unit had begged off, preferring regular guard duty or supply runs. But James had said yes immediately, driven by reasons he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. He was from Birmingham, Alabama, where the rules of racial hierarchy were absolute and brutally enforced. He had grown up understanding that the color of his skin determined which doors he could enter, which water fountains he could drink from, which dreams he was allowed to pursue. The army was supposed to be different, a place where merit and courage mattered more than race. But the army was segregated too, black soldiers in black units, often given the worst assignments, rarely trusted with combat roles, always reminded that democracy had limits. The 93rd Infantry Regiment, James's unit, had spent most of the war in logistics and support operations. They loaded supplies, guarded installations, managed prisoners. Necessary work, but not the kind that earned medals or respect. Some of the guys resented it. Marcus Johnson, James's bunkmate, was bitter about the whole situation. We're good enough to die for this country, but not good enough to fight beside white soldiers. Good enough to guard Japanese prisoners, but not good enough to eat in a white restaurant back home. What kind of sense does that make? James understood the anger. He felt it too sometimes late at night when the contradictions became too heavy to ignore. But his mother had raised him with different wisdom. Treat people the way you want to be treated, she always said. Not the way they treat you, the way you want to be treated. That's how you keep your soul intact. That's how you prove you're better than the hate. So when Sergeant Carter explained that the new orders from Captain Morrison required proper treatment of civilian prisoners, including adequate meals served with respect, James had volunteered. He wanted to be part of something decent, something that proved black soldiers could uphold standards even when those standards were denied to them at home. He had spent 2 hours that morning preparing this breakfast. The mess sergeant, a white guy from Texas who surprisingly didn't give James any trouble, had allocated proper rations. Rice cooked the way he'd learned from watching the Japanese-American interpreter, Corporal Henry Nakamura. Tea brewed strong because that's how he'd heard Japanese people preferred it. Fruit from the local supply, arranged as nicely as he could manage. It wasn't fancy, but it was dignified, and dignity mattered. Now, standing in the courtyard as the Japanese nurse stared at the table with an expression of complete confusion, James felt suddenly uncertain. Had he done something wrong? Was this offensive somehow? He didn't speak Japanese, didn't know the cultural rules, was working entirely from Sergeant Carter's instructions and his own instincts about how to treat another human being with respect. Emiko's mind raced through possibilities. Was the food poisoned? Was this a cruel joke, a final meal before execution? Was it a test of some kind? She looked at the young soldier, trying to read his expression. He seemed nervous, but not malicious. His hands remained open, unthreatening. He gestured again toward the table, then pointed to himself and said something in English she didn't understand. Behind her, one of the escorts said something. The young soldier by the table nodded, then walked closer to Emiko. She tensed, but he stopped at a respectful distance and picked up one of the bowls of rice. He held it out to her with both hands, arms extended, in a gesture that was unmistakably Japanese in its formality. A bow of offering, the kind you would use when serving an honored guest. The contradiction was too much. Emiko's carefully constructed acceptance of death collapsed into confusion, then something close to vertigo. This didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Why would her executioners offer her breakfast? Why would American soldiers use Japanese gestures of respect? Why was this happening? She took the bowl, because refusing seemed impossible. The rice was warm against her palms. Real rice. Properly cooked, not the half-rotten scraps she had eaten during the final weeks before capture. The soldier smiled again, genuine pleasure in his expression, and gestured toward the table once more. The two escorts had withdrawn to the gate, giving her space. The young soldier stepped back to the table, giving her room to approach or refuse. Everything about their body language suggested she was not in immediate danger. Everything about this situation contradicted every expectation she had carried into this courtyard. Slowly, mechanically, Emiko walked to the table. She set down the bowl of rice, and her hands shook so badly she nearly knocked it over. The soldier reached out to steady it, then quickly withdrew his hand as if aware that touching her might be inappropriate. He pointed to a stool someone had placed beside the table. Sit. Eat. That message came through clearly even without shared language. Emiko sat. The soldier poured tea from a metal pot into one of the cups, steam rising in a small cloud. He placed the cup near her, then stepped back again, maintaining that careful distance. He said something in English, his tone gentle, almost apologetic. She understood nothing except the emotional content, reassurance, kindness, an attempt at hospitality in impossible circumstances. She picked up the teacup. It burned her fingers slightly, but the pain felt grounding, real. Proof this wasn't a dream or delusion. She brought the cup to her lips and sipped. It was too hot and not prepared the way she preferred, but it was tea, real tea, the first she had tasted since capture. The warmth spread through her chest, and to her absolute horror, she felt tears beginning to form. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of enemy soldiers. Not when she still didn't understand what was happening. She set down the cup carefully and focused on breathing, on maintaining composure, on being worthy of her father's lessons about dignity in the face of death. Except, she wasn't facing death, apparently. She was facing breakfast, which was somehow more disorienting than a firing squad would have been. James watched the woman struggle with her emotions and felt a profound empathy he hadn't anticipated. She was terrified. That much was obvious. But she was fighting not to show it. Pride, he thought. Dignity under pressure, he recognized that struggle. How many times had he swallowed his own fear and anger to maintain composure in front of white officers who assumed black soldiers were cowards or fools? How many times had he stood at attention, faced neutral, while being treated as less than human, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break? This woman, this enemy nurse who probably believed every piece of propaganda her government had fed her about American brutality, was doing the same thing. She was scared but wouldn't show it. She was confused but wouldn't ask for explanation. She was maintaining her dignity in a situation designed to strip it away. James respected that. He respected the hell out of it. He picked up the plate of fruit and set it closer to her, then pointed to his own mouth and made an exaggerated eating gesture, trying to communicate that the food was safe, that he wasn't trying to trick her. She looked at him with dark eyes that held intelligence and fear in equal measure. Then slowly, she picked up a piece of papaya and ate it. The sweetness of the fruit was almost painful after weeks of bland rations. Emiko chewed slowly, swallowed, and felt her empty stomach awaken with hunger she had been suppressing. The soldier watched her eat with an expression of quiet satisfaction, as if her acceptance of the food meant something to him personally. He said something else in English, then pointed to the rice, then to the other items on the table. Eat. That's what he was saying. All of this is for you. Eat. So Emiko ate. She ate rice with her fingers because there were no chopsticks, ate fruit that stained her hands with juice, drank tea that gradually cooled to a drinkable temperature. And as she ate, The young soldier stood nearby, not hovering but present, occasionally refilling her tea or offering another piece of fruit, maintaining that strange, careful formality that felt more Japanese than American. The two escort soldiers remained by the gate, talking quietly to each other, paying minimal attention to the scene. Morning birds sang in the acacia tree. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. The compound was waking up, beginning another day of whatever this strange new reality was. And Emiko Hayashi, who had expected to die at dawn, was instead having breakfast served by an enemy soldier who treated her with more respect than many of her own countrymen had shown in recent months. Private James Washington had no idea he was participating in something historically significant. He was just following orders and his own sense of what decent behavior looked like. Sergeant Carter had briefed him the night before on the new protocols for civilian prisoners. Geneva Convention standards, the sergeant had explained. We treat them humanely, we feed them adequately. We don't abuse or humiliate them. Not because they deserve it necessarily, but because we're better than that. Because that's what distinguishes civilization from barbarism. James had listened and nodded, and understood something deeper than the sergeant explicitly stated. This was about winning the peace, not just the war. This was about proving that American democracy, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, represented something genuinely different from the militaristic nationalism of fascist powers. This was about moral authority. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was helping enforce a standard of human equality and dignity that his own country denied him. He couldn't eat at a white restaurant in Birmingham, but he could feed enemy prisoners according to international law. He couldn't vote in Alabama due to poll taxes and literacy tests designed to exclude black citizens, but he could ensure Japanese nurses received their Geneva Convention rights. The contradiction was absurd, painful, and yet somehow also meaningful. Because maybe, James thought, maybe the way you build a better world isn't by waiting for perfection before you practice decency. Maybe it's by upholding the standards you believe in even when those standards aren't applied to you. Maybe it's by being the America you want to exist, rather than the America that currently does exist. His mother would approve of that logic. She would tell him to be the change, to plant seeds of goodness even in contaminated soil, to have faith that integrity matters even when justice is delayed. Emiko finished the rice and set down the empty bowl. The soldier immediately offered more, but she shook her head. She was full, genuinely full for the first time in weeks. The soldier nodded, accepting her refusal, then collected the empty dishes with the same careful formality he had used to serve them. He said something that sounded like a question. She didn't understand the words but understood the tone. Is there anything else you need? She shook her head again. He smiled, that same nervous but genuine smile, and gestured back toward the gate where the two escorts waited. The meal was over. Time to return to the warehouse prison. But as Emiko stood and turned toward the gate, the young soldier called out. She looked back. He brought his hands together at his chest and bowed. A small bow, not deep, but unmistakably Japanese in style. A gesture of respect. A farewell. Emiko's throat tightened. Almost without thinking, she bowed back. The movement was automatic, cultural, a response to courtesy with courtesy. The soldier's smile widened. He said something else, the words meaningless to her, but the kindness in his voice was a language that transcended vocabulary. The escorts led her back across the compound. She walked in silence, her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. What had just happened? Why had they fed her? Why had that soldier learned to bow? What did any of this mean? When she returned to the warehouse, the other women rushed toward her. Yuki grabbed her hands, tears streaming down her face. We thought they killed you. We were so afraid. Are you hurt? What did they do? Nothing, Emiko heard herself say. They did nothing. They fed me breakfast. The silence that followed was profound. 14 women stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Haruko, the eldest, was the first to respond. What do you mean they fed you? So Emiko described it. The courtyard, the table, the young black soldier who had served her rice and tea and fruit with careful respect. The gestures of hospitality, the attempt at a Japanese bow, the escorts who had given her space rather than crowding her with hostility, the complete absence of violence or threat. Several of the women didn't believe her. Chio, a nurse from Osaka, suggested it was a trick, a way to lower their guard before the real punishment began. But Haruko listened carefully, her lined face thoughtful. I have heard, she said quietly, that the Americans follow something called the Geneva Convention, rules for how prisoners must be treated. Perhaps it is true. Rules for prisoners, Yuki said bitterly. Since when do wars have rules? Since when do victors show mercy? Since always, Haruko replied. At least in theory. Whether anyone follows the rules is another question. But perhaps these Americans do. Perhaps we have been fortunate in who captured us. The conversation continued for hours, everyone processing this new information, debating what it meant for their future. Emiko participated but felt distant, her mind still back in that courtyard, trying to understand the moment when the young soldier had bowed to her. That gesture had carried more weight than any words could have. It had acknowledged her humanity, her cultural identity, her worthiness of respect, despite being an enemy prisoner. It had contradicted everything she had been taught about American attitudes toward Japanese people. What Major Kobayashi had told them before disappearing into the jungle played through her memory. The Americans will show no mercy. They view us as subhuman. They will rape, torture, and kill without hesitation. Surrender means death, just slower and more degrading than an honorable bullet. But that wasn't what had happened. The Americans hadn't shown mercy. Mercy implied power, choosing to withhold deserved punishment. What Emiko had experienced felt different. The soldier hadn't acted like someone choosing to spare a guilty prisoner. He had acted like someone serving a guest. Formal, respectful, almost nervous about getting the details right. That wasn't mercy. That was something closer to recognition. One human acknowledging another across the divide of language and war. The distinction mattered. Emiko didn't fully understand why yet, but it mattered. Over the following days, the pattern continued. The women were fed regularly, simple food but adequate. They received medical attention when needed. Guards maintained professional distance but weren't cruel. Corporal Henry Nakamura, the Japanese-American interpreter, explained the rules and answered questions with patience. His presence disturbed many of the women deeply. To them, he was a traitor, a Japanese man in American uniform, fighting against his own people. But Nakamura showed no defensiveness about his position. When Yuki asked him how he could betray Japan, he replied calmly, "I was born in California. I have never been to Japan. This is my country." "But your face," Yuki insisted. "Your blood. Don't those things matter?" "My loyalty matters," Nakamura said. "My values matter. My face and blood are just biology. I choose what they mean." The conversation haunted Emiko. She had been raised to believe that blood and nation were inseparable, that Japanese identity was inherent and eternal, that loyalty was a matter of birth rather than choice. But here was a man with a Japanese face, speaking perfect Japanese and yet firmly identifying as American. How was that possible? How could identity be chosen rather than inherited? These questions occupied her thoughts during the long empty hours in the warehouse. The days developed a rhythm. Morning rice, afternoon work assignments, evening meals, lights out at a fixed hour. The work was usually simple: laundry for the camp, basic cleaning, helping in the kitchen gardens. Nothing exploitative or degrading. The guards supervising the work were mostly from the 93rd Regiment, mostly black soldiers who maintained professional courtesy. Some were friendly, others distant, but none were cruel. Emiko found herself watching these men, trying to understand them. They laughed together during breaks, complained about officers when they thought no one was listening, traded cigarettes and photographs from home. They were human, obviously, and yet she had been so thoroughly trained to view enemy soldiers as monsters that their ordinary humanity felt revolutionary. One afternoon while working in the garden, Emiko saw the young soldier from the courtyard, the one who had served her breakfast. He was on guard duty, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching the prisoner work detail from a distance. When he noticed her looking, he nodded in recognition. She froze, uncertain how to respond. He smiled slightly, that same nervous, friendly expression, then returned his attention to his duties. Beside her, Yuki whispered, "That is the one? The one who fed you?" "Yes," Emiko confirmed. "He looks so young. We all look young. The war has made children into soldiers and soldiers into ghosts." Yuki was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think he is kind or just following orders?" Emiko considered the question. "Does it matter? If the orders require kindness, and he follows them, the result is the same. But intention matters." If he is only kind because commanded to be, that is not real kindness. Emiko watched the soldier scanning the perimeter, dutiful and alert. I think he would be kind even without orders, she said finally. I think that is who he is. She didn't know why she believed that. She had no evidence beyond a single breakfast and a smile. But something about the soldier's careful formality, his nervousness about getting the details right, suggested someone who cared about doing things properly, not because he feared punishment, but because he believed in doing things properly. That kind of integrity was recognizable across any cultural divide. Private James Washington had noticed the Japanese nurse working in the garden, but he didn't approach. Sergeant Carter had been clear about maintaining boundaries. Professional distance, the sergeant had said. Courtesy, but not familiarity. These people are prisoners, not friends. Treat them humanely, but don't forget they served enemy forces. Some of their fellow soldiers committed atrocities against our troops and Filipino civilians. Compassion is policy, but caution is wisdom. James understood the logic, but felt its incompleteness. Yes, some Japanese soldiers had committed atrocities. He had heard the stories, seen the evidence. But did that guilt extend to every person who happened to be Japanese? Did it extend to civilian nurses who had probably spent the war tending wounds rather than inflicting them? Where was the line between legitimate justice and collective punishment? These were questions above his pay grade. Captain Morrison made policy. Sergeant Carter enforced it. James followed orders. But late at night in his bunk, listening to Marcus Johnson complain about the absurdity of their situation, James found himself thinking deeply about the nature of justice and mercy, about collective guilt and individual humanity, about the difference between defeating an enemy and demonizing an entire people. Marcus didn't share his ambivalence. Those Japanese bastards tortured our guys in the Philippines, Marcus said one evening. Bataan Death March, Palawan Massacre, POW camps where our soldiers died of starvation and disease while their guards laughed. And now we're supposed to feed their people tea and fruit? We're supposed to bow to them like they're honored guests? That's not justice, James. That's us being suckers. James understood Marcus's anger. The atrocities were real and documented. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners had been horrific in many cases, violating every standard of human decency. The Geneva Convention had been meaningless to Imperial Japanese forces. Surrender had been viewed as ultimate disgrace, and those who surrendered were treated as unworthy of life. Thousands of Allied POWs had died in Japanese captivity under conditions of deliberate cruelty. So why, Marcus demanded, should we treat their prisoners better than they treated ours? Why should we be the ones following rules they ignored? Because, James said slowly, working through the logic as he spoke, because if we sink to their level, what makes us different? If we become cruel because they were cruel, what are we fighting for? We're supposed to represent something better than fascism and militarism. If we don't act better, what's the point? The point is winning, Marcus shot back. And we won. Now we show them what happens when you start a war with America. Winning isn't just about who has more bombs, James insisted. It's about who has better values. If our values only work when it's convenient, they're not really values. Marcus snorted. Easy to talk about values when it's not your family who died in the Bataan March. Easy to be philosophical when you weren't in a Japanese POW camp eating rats to survive. That was fair. James hadn't experienced Japanese atrocities personally. Maybe if he had, he would feel differently. Maybe mercy would seem like betrayal of the men who had suffered. But he kept thinking about his mother's words. You keep your soul intact by treating people right, not by matching evil with evil. And he kept thinking about the terror in that nurse's eyes the morning he served her breakfast, the way she had trembled while trying to maintain dignity, the profound relief when she realized she wasn't going to be executed. She thought we were going to kill her, James said, that morning in the courtyard. She thought she was being taken to her death. Maybe she deserved to be scared, Marcus replied. Maybe that's a tiny fraction of what our guys felt in Japanese camps. But we didn't kill her. We fed her. And that difference, that restraint, that choice to follow our values even when they didn't follow theirs, that's what makes us the good guys. That's what makes this war worth fighting. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, You're a better man than me, James Washington. Or maybe just more naive. I can't decide which. Neither can I, James admitted. But I know what my mama taught me. And I know what kind of man I want to be, and those two things line up with treating that nurse decent. So that's what I'm going to do." The conversation ended there, but the questions lingered. James found himself thinking about the nurse, Emiko. He had learned her name from Corporal Nakamura, and wondering what her war had been like. Had she volunteered or been conscripted? Had she believed in the imperial cause or just tried to survive? Had she treated wounded American soldiers in that field hospital? And if so, had she treated them cruelly or with the professional detachment of medical personnel? He would never know the answers. The language barrier made real conversation impossible, but he could see her dignity, her intelligence, her quiet strength in the face of uncertainty. Those qualities were recognizable regardless of nationality, and recognizing them made it impossible to view her as merely an enemy, merely a symbol of Japanese aggression, merely someone who deserved punishment for her country's sins. Sergeant Eugene Carter watched his men wrestle with these moral questions and felt a quiet pride. The 93rd Regiment had been given a difficult assignment, managing Japanese prisoners according to standards higher than those the Japanese had shown Allied prisoners. It would have been easy, maybe even understandable, for black soldiers facing discrimination in their own military to treat enemy prisoners harshly. Why should men denied equality at home enforce equality for defeated enemies? But Captain Morrison had been clear about expectations. "We follow the Geneva Convention not because our enemies deserve it, but because we are better than our enemies. We prove American values through our actions, not just our words. The United States claims to represent freedom, democracy, and human dignity. If we compromise those values out of revenge or convenience, we lose the moral authority that justifies this entire war." Carter had passed those instructions down the chain of command, and to his pride, the men of the 93rd had risen to the challenge. There had been incidents, a guard speaking roughly to a prisoner, a work detail pushed harder than necessary, but nothing serious, nothing systemic. For the most part, black soldiers who knew intimately what it felt like to be treated as less than human had chosen to treat enemy prisoners as fully human. That choice, Carter believed, said something profound about character and values. He mentioned this to Captain Morrison during a weekly briefing. "The men are doing well with the prisoner detail, sir. Better than I initially expected." Morrison, a Massachusetts native whose father had been a professor of philosophy at Harvard, nodded thoughtfully. "They understand what we're trying to accomplish?" "I think so, sir. Some more than others. There's natural resentment given Japanese atrocities against our troops, but overall they grasp that this is about demonstrating American superiority, moral superiority, not just military." "Good," Morrison said, "because this matters more than they probably realize. Every Japanese prisoner who experiences fair treatment becomes a witness to American values. When these people return to Japan, they will remember how we treated them. Some will become allies in Reconstruction. Some will influence others. We are winning the peace right now, Sergeant, in these daily interactions. What about the men who struggle with it, sir? The ones who think we're being too soft?" Morrison considered. "Remind them that discipline and decency are not weakness. Remind them that revenge is easy, but building a lasting peace requires restraint. And remind them that the eyes of history are watching. Someday people will ask what American soldiers did after victory. I want the answer to reflect credit on this unit and this army." "Yes, sir." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "How is Private Washington doing? He volunteered for the breakfast detail, correct?" "Yes, sir. He has been exemplary. Treats the prisoners with respect, follows protocols precisely, shows genuine concern for their welfare. Good man. Make sure he knows his conduct is noted and appreciated." "Will do, sir." After Carter left, Morrison sat alone in his office thinking about the moral complexities of his position. He had studied history at university, had read extensively about war and peace, about the Treaty of Versailles, and how punitive terms had contributed to the rise of Nazi Germany. The lesson was clear. Crush your enemy, yes, but don't humiliate them so thoroughly that they have nothing to live for except revenge. Defeat them militarily, then offer them a path back to civilization. Show them that cooperation benefits everyone, that the victors can be magnanimous without being weak. Japan would need to be occupied, restructured, demilitarized. That process would be difficult and lengthy, but it would be impossible if the Japanese people viewed Americans as vengeful demons. Every fair interaction, every demonstration of American decency, Every moment when prisoners expected brutality but received humanity instead. Those moments were strategic investments in a peaceful future. Morrison didn't share these strategic thoughts with most of his men. Soldiers needed simpler guidance. Follow the rules, treat prisoners humanely, maintain discipline. But he hoped some of them understood the deeper purpose. He hoped men like Private Washington realized they were participating in something historically significant, that their small acts of kindness were helping to build a new Pacific order, that their restraint mattered. Emiko began to understand this gradually. She listened to Corporal Nakamura's explanations about American POW policy. She watched the guards maintain professional standards day after day. She noticed that promises were kept. Medical treatment delivered as promised. Food rations provided consistently. Work assignments rotated fairly. There was no pattern of deception, no gradual erosion of treatment, no reveal of hidden cruelty. This created a deep cognitive dissonance. Everything Major Kobayashi had told them was proving false. The Americans were not torturing prisoners. They were not raping women. They were not starving captives or working them to death. Instead, they were following rules, international rules, codified rules, rules that apparently mattered more to them than revenge. Why? Emiko asked Nakamura one afternoon during a break. Why do they treat us this way when American soldiers were treated so badly by the Japanese? Nakamura was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable. Because, he said finally, because America believes in certain principles. Democracy, human rights, the rule of law. Those principles are meaningless if they only apply to Americans. If they are real principles and not just propaganda, they must apply even to enemies. But that seems naive. In war, only survival matters. Maybe, Nakamura acknowledged. But what happens after war? If you win through brutality, you create a peace built on resentment. America wants something more stable than that. America wants former enemies to become allies. That requires showing that American values are real and beneficial. Emiko considered this. So we are being treated well for strategic reasons, not moral ones. The two are not exclusive, Nakamura said. Strategy based on immoral actions fails eventually. People rebel against cruelty. But strategy based on moral principles can succeed long-term. You are being treated well because American values require it, and also because it serves American interests to demonstrate those values. Both things are true. This conversation fundamentally altered Emiko's understanding of her situation. She had been thinking in terms of mercy, her captors choosing to spare her out of kindness or whim. But Nakamura was describing something different. A system, a policy, a deliberate choice by American leadership to use humane treatment as a weapon more powerful than cruelty. By treating prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, America was proving its moral superiority over Japanese militarism. Every meal served, every medical treatment provided, every respectful interaction was evidence that democracy produced better outcomes than fascism. It was brilliant, Emiko realized. And it was working. She could feel her own attitudes shifting. The Americans were still enemies in the sense that they had defeated Japan, but they were not monsters. They were not demons. They were people with a system that, despite its flaws, apparently functioned better than the militaristic nationalism she had been raised to revere. That realization was painful. It meant admitting that Major Kobayashi had been wrong, or had lied, or had been deceived himself. It meant questioning everything she had been taught about the war, about Japanese superiority, about the necessity of fighting to the last breath, rather than accepting shameful surrender. If American values produced better treatment of prisoners than Japanese values, what did that say about which side deserved to win? These thoughts felt treasonous. They felt like betrayal of her nation, her emperor, her fallen comrades. But they were also unavoidable once the evidence became overwhelming. She was alive, healthy, and treated with basic dignity because Americans followed rules that Japan had ignored. That fact spoke louder than any propaganda. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into captivity. Captain Morrison authorized expanded privileges for the civilian prisoners, including access to news broadcasts and letters home. Standing in the warehouse listening to Nakamura translate the latest radio reports, Emiko heard for the first time the full scope of Japan's defeat. Atomic bombs destroying Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declaring war and crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria, The Emperor's surrender broadcast, which she had missed while in captivity. The complete collapse of the imperial war effort. Several women wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Haruko murmured prayers. Yuki, always the most emotional, collapsed with grief. But Emiko felt something unexpected. Relief. It was over. The war that had consumed years of her life, that had sent thousands to death, that had promised only endless suffering until eventual victory or total annihilation. It was finished. Japan had lost, but the fighting was done. And she was alive. Against all expectation, against every warning from Major Kobayashi, against the logic of revenge and collective punishment, she was alive. The Americans had captured her and fed her breakfast instead of executing her. They had treated her wounds and provided shelter and followed their rules. They had demonstrated that victory did not require cruelty, that strength could include restraint, that winning the war meant building peace. That evening, Emiko lay on her mat listening to the other women process their grief, and she thought about the young soldier who had served her tea. Private Washington, Nakamura had told her when she asked, from Alabama, 23 years old, part of a unit of black soldiers who faced discrimination in their own army, but maintained professionalism despite it. She thought about his careful formality that morning in the courtyard, the way he had held the bowl with both hands, mimicking Japanese custom, the nervous smile that suggested he wanted to do this right, that treating her with respect mattered to him personally, the bow at the end, awkward, but sincere. She thought about Corporal Nakamura, Japanese by blood but American by choice, translating between worlds with patient professionalism. She thought about Sergeant Carter, who supervised the prisoner details with firm but fair discipline. She thought about Captain Morrison, whose policies created the framework for all these small acts of decency. And she thought about Major Kobayashi, who had lied to them or been deceived himself, who had promised them torture and death, who had disappeared into the jungle rather than face capture. He had been wrong about everything that mattered. The Americans were not monsters. Surrender did not mean death. The rules of war were not just propaganda. There was such a thing as victory without vengeance. This understanding settled into her bones like acceptance of a truth too large to ignore. The world was different than she had been taught. Values mattered. Systems mattered. Choices mattered. America had chosen to treat prisoners according to principles rather than emotions, and that choice had saved her life and was beginning to change her mind. In the following weeks, the prisoner camp developed rhythms that felt almost normal. Work details, meal times, evening gatherings where the women talked or sang or tried to maintain some connection to home. Emiko volunteered for medical duties, assisting Lieutenant Bradford, the American doctor, with treating sick prisoners. Bradford was professional and skilled, treating Japanese patients with the same care he gave American soldiers. He showed Emiko techniques she hadn't learned in nursing school, explained the reasoning behind treatments, acknowledged her competence with respectful collegiality. Working beside an American doctor, using American medical supplies to treat Japanese patients, Emiko experienced a kind of cognitive whiplash. These were enemies. They had bombed her country, killed her countrymen, destroyed her world. And yet here they were, sharing medical knowledge, cooperating to heal the sick, recognizing each other as professionals united by the common purpose of reducing suffering. Medicine transcends war, Bradford said one afternoon while they were suturing a prisoner's laceration. The Hippocratic Oath does not recognize nationality. My job is healing, regardless of who needs healing. But your country is at war with mine, Emiko replied through Nakamura's translation. How can you treat us the same as your own soldiers? Bradford smiled slightly. Because infection does not care about nationality. Disease does not check passports. Pain is pain, suffering is suffering, regardless of which flag you salute. If I let politics determine who deserves medical care, I am not a doctor. I am a propagandist with a stethoscope. Emiko found herself respecting Bradford deeply. He represented something she had been taught did not exist. Enemy soldiers with genuine moral principles, applying those principles consistently even when it cost them advantage. Bradford could have provided minimal treatment, done just enough to comply with regulations while remaining detached and cold. Instead, he treated prisoners as patients, with professional concern and medical rigor. This pattern repeated across the camp. The cooks prepared adequate food, not punitive starvation rations. The guards maintained security without harassment. The administrators processed paperwork efficiently, keeping records that would facilitate eventual repatriation. The interpreters translated fairly, not adding editorial commentary or distorting meaning. Everyone from Captain Morrison down to the newest private seemed to have internalized the same message: follow the rules, maintain standards, treat prisoners humanely. For Emiko, raised in a militaristic culture where strength was often conflated with cruelty, this systematic decency was revelatory. American power did not require brutality to be effective. American victory did not demand humiliation of the defeated. American values, whatever their limitations and hypocrisies, apparently included restraint and proportionality in a way Japanese militarism had not. She mentioned this to Haruko one evening. The older woman listened carefully, then said, "I think we were taught to mistake cruelty for strength. We were told that mercy was weakness, that compassion was shameful, that only absolute ruthlessness could achieve victory. But these Americans are proving that is false. They have shown mercy and still won. They have followed rules and still achieved total victory. Perhaps true strength includes restraint." Yuki, sitting nearby, was less convinced. Or perhaps they are only kind because they have already won. Perhaps kindness is a luxury of victory. If they were losing, they might be as cruel as Major Kobayashi warned. Maybe, Haruko acknowledged. But they are not losing. They have won. And they are choosing kindness now, in this moment when cruelty would be easier and arguably justified, given what Japan did to American prisoners. That choice matters. That choice tells us something about who they are. The conversation continued late into the evening, the women wrestling with questions of morality and power, victory and defeat, the nature of strength and the value of restraint. There were no easy answers, but the mere fact that they were alive to debate these questions was evidence that American victory had taken a form different from what they had been taught to expect. Private James Washington observed these changes in the prisoners from his position as guard and occasional server of meals. The fear had diminished. The women no longer flinched when guards approached. They no longer whispered constantly about execution or torture. They had begun to believe gradually that the treatment they received was not a temporary deception, but an actual policy that would continue. This was satisfying to James in a way he struggled to articulate. He had been part of creating that security, that gradual trust, that transition from terror to cautious acceptance. His small actions, serving breakfast respectfully, maintaining professional courtesy, following the rules even when no one was watching, had contributed to something larger than himself. He had helped prove that American values could be more than empty words, that democracy could produce genuinely better outcomes than fascism, that black soldiers could uphold standards of human dignity even when denied those standards themselves. Sergeant Carter noticed James's dedication and mentioned it in a report that reached Captain Morrison. The captain called James into his office one afternoon. "At ease, Private. I want to commend you for your work with the prisoner details. Sergeant Carter tells me you have been exemplary." "Thank you, sir. Just following orders, sir." "It's more than that," Morrison said. "Orders provide the framework, but execution requires character. You have shown consistent professionalism and genuine concern for prisoner welfare. That matters. That reflects credit on you, on this unit, and on the Army." James stood straighter. "I appreciate that, sir. I am just trying to do the right thing." "The right thing is often the hardest thing," Morrison observed, "especially when you have legitimate reasons to harbor resentment. I am aware that men in this unit face discrimination that civilian prisoners do not face. That irony is not lost on me. The fact that you maintain standards despite that irony speaks to your character. My mama raised me to treat people right, sir. Not the way they treat me, but the way I want to be treated. She said that is how you keep your soul intact. Your mother is a wise woman, and her wisdom is serving American interests in this compound. Every prisoner who experiences fair treatment becomes a potential advocate for cooperation during reconstruction. You are helping to win the peace, Private. Never forget that." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." After James left, Morrison made a note in his personal journal. These men, black soldiers enforcing equality for enemy prisoners while denied equality themselves, represent the best of American potential. They prove that our values can transcend our failures, that progress is possible, that the gap between ideals and reality can be closed through individual acts of integrity. If we can somehow extend to them the same rights they extend to prisoners, America will fulfill its promise. If we cannot, we will remain a partial democracy, aspirational but incomplete. Morrison had been raised in progressive circles in Boston. His father's academic work had focused on moral philosophy, particularly questions of justice and rights. Morrison had absorbed those lessons and carried them into military service. He viewed his command of this POW facility as more than just a wartime duty. It was a laboratory for demonstrating that American democratic values could produce tangible benefits, that rules-based order was superior to might-makes-right authoritarianism, that treating people humanely was not just morally correct, but strategically effective. The results were proving his theory correct. Prisoner cooperation was high. Incidents of resistance or escape attempts were virtually non-existent. The Japanese civilians, once convinced they were not going to be murdered, had become compliant and occasionally even helpful. Some volunteered information about remaining Japanese holdouts in the mountains. Others provided intelligence about conditions in occupied territories. A few expressed genuine gratitude for the treatment they received. This was precisely what Morrison had hoped for, a virtuous cycle where humane treatment led to cooperation, which justified continued humane treatment, which further deepened cooperation. Contrast that with the vicious cycle of cruelty breeding resistance, which justified further cruelty, which bred further resistance until the entire system collapsed into mutual atrocity. Morrison shared these observations in reports to higher command. The strategic value of Geneva Convention compliance cannot be overstated. Every prisoner treated fairly becomes a witness to American values. When repatriation begins, these individuals will return to Japan with stories that contradict years of militaristic propaganda. They will tell their families, their communities, their countrymen that Americans are not demons, that surrender does not mean death, that cooperation with occupation forces is safe and potentially beneficial. This will facilitate the reconstruction process immeasurably. Not everyone in the command structure agreed with Morrison's approach. Some officers argued for harsher treatment, for making Japanese prisoners work harder, for providing minimal rations and accommodations. Why waste resources on people whose army raped Nanking and tortured our POWs? Let them experience what they inflicted on others. Morrison understood the anger, but considered it strategically foolish. Revenge feels satisfying in the moment but creates long-term problems. We need Japan to become a stable democracy allied with the United States, not a resentful population nursing grievances and waiting for another chance to strike. Every act of unnecessary cruelty toward prisoners undermines that goal. Every demonstration of American decency advances it. His superiors eventually agreed, or at least acquiesced. The policy remained: Geneva Convention standards, humane treatment, professionalism over vengeance. And in small camps across the Pacific Theater, men like James Washington continued to prove that the policy could work, that ordinary soldiers could uphold extraordinary standards, that America could win not just through firepower, but through demonstrated moral superiority. The weeks turned to months. September brought news of formal surrender ceremonies. October brought the beginning of demobilization plans. November brought discussions of prisoner repatriation. The war was not just over but was receding into history, replaced by the complex work of occupation and reconstruction. For Emiko, these months represented a transformation more profound than physical liberation. She had entered captivity expecting death, and found instead a system that valued her life despite having every practical and emotional reason not to. She had encountered enemy soldiers who treated her with more humanity than some of her own countrymen had shown. She had witnessed Americans practicing values that Japan had claimed to monopolize: honor, discipline, respect for hierarchy, concern for the vulnerable. The contradictions forced her to rebuild her entire worldview. Japan had not been the virtuous nation she had been taught to believe in. The militarists had lied about American barbarism. The Emperor's divine mission had led to catastrophic defeat. Everything she had believed, everything she had sacrificed for, had been built on propaganda and delusion. This realization was painful, but also liberating. If the old certainties were false, then new possibilities existed. Japan could rebuild, not as a militaristic empire, but as something different. Democracy, the system she had been taught to despise as weak and chaotic, had produced soldiers who followed rules and treated enemies fairly. Perhaps democracy was not weakness but a different kind of strength, restrained, systematic, law-based rather than power-based. In late November, Corporal Nakamura informed the women that repatriation plans were being finalized. You will return to Japan within the next few months. You will be processed through reception centers, documented and released to return to your families. You are free to go home. Home. The word felt strange. Emiko had not seen Yokohama in nearly 3 years. Her parents had probably given her up for dead. The city itself might be destroyed. American bombing raids had targeted urban centers relentlessly. What would she be returning to? What kind of Japan would exist after total defeat? But she would be returning alive, educated by experience, fundamentally changed by her months in American captivity. She would return as a witness to the possibility of honorable defeat, of enemies who followed rules, of strength that included mercy. She would carry those lessons back to a homeland that desperately needed to learn them. The day before the first group of prisoners was scheduled for repatriation, Captain Morrison arranged a final assembly. Through Nakamura's translation, he addressed the Japanese civilians. You came here as prisoners. You were treated according to the Geneva Convention and the values of American democracy. Some of you may have expected worse. Some of you may have been taught that Americans are cruel or barbaric. I hope your experience here has demonstrated otherwise. You are being released to return to your families. What you tell them about your treatment here is entirely up to you, but I hope you will tell them the truth, that America defeated Japan militarily, but treats defeated enemies with dignity and respect. We do not seek revenge. We seek a lasting peace built on mutual understanding and cooperation. Go home. Rebuild your lives. Help rebuild your country. And remember that former enemies can become future friends if both sides choose honor over hatred. The speech, translated carefully by Nakamura, created a profound silence. Some women wept. Others bowed. Haruko stood, and in halting English she had been learning said, "Thank you. We will remember. We will tell truth." Morrison bowed slightly in return. "Safe travels. May you find your families well." That evening, the women held a final gathering in the warehouse. They sang traditional songs, shared memories of home, made promises to find each other after repatriation. It felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. Emiko lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, thinking about the journey ahead. Tomorrow she would leave this camp, board a transport ship, sail back to Japan. She would face the reality of defeat, the devastation of her homeland, the difficult work of rebuilding amid ruins. But she would face it with knowledge that most Japanese civilians did not yet possess: direct experience of American values in practice, evidence that cooperation with occupation forces need not mean humiliation or exploitation. She thought about Private Washington, who had served her breakfast on the morning she expected to die. She thought about Lieutenant Bradford, who had treated her patients with professional care. She thought about Sergeant Carter and Captain Morrison, who had created and enforced policies that saved lives and demonstrated that victory could be magnanimous. She thought about Corporal Nakamura, whose divided identity had taught her that loyalty could be chosen rather than inherited. These men had given her something more valuable than mercy. They had given her evidence that systems based on law rather than power, on rights rather than might, on principles rather than expediency, could actually work. They had proven through daily action that democracy was not just propaganda, but a functional framework that produced genuinely better outcomes. That lesson would stay with her. When other Japanese citizens raged against the occupation, she would remember fair treatment in captivity. When militarists urged resistance and revenge, she would remember that the Americans had fed her when they could have killed her. When cynics claimed that all nations were equally cruel in pursuit of self-interest, she would remember Sergeant Carter's insistence on Geneva Convention compliance, even when compliance was difficult and revenge would have been easier. The next morning, James Washington was on duty as the first transport of repatriated prisoners prepared to leave. He watched the Japanese women board the trucks, most carrying small bundles of belongings provided by the camp. Some looked relieved. Others looked apprehensive. All looked profoundly changed by their experience. He spotted Emiko in the group. She was helping Yuki, the younger nurse, who was struggling with anxiety about the journey. Emiko's calm competence was evident even from a distance. She had survived not just the war but the aftermath, had processed trauma and uncertainty, and emerged with her dignity intact. As her group prepared to board, Emiko glanced across the compound and made eye contact with James. For a moment, they looked at each other across the cultural and linguistic divide that separated them. Then Emiko bowed, a formal, respectful bow that acknowledged not just the individual, but what he represented. James, remembering that morning months ago when he had awkwardly attempted a Japanese gesture of respect, bowed back. It was still clumsy, still obviously American, but sincere, a final mutual acknowledgement of shared humanity. Emiko boarded the truck. The convoy pulled away. James stood watching until the dust settled and the compound returned to its usual rhythms. He felt an unexpected sense of loss. He would never know what happened to Emiko after repatriation, whether she found her family, whether she thrived in post-war Japan, whether his small act of kindness on that August morning had made any lasting difference. But he hoped it had. He hoped she would remember that breakfast, that moment when she expected death and found hospitality instead. He hoped she would tell others about it, would carry that story into a Japan that needed to believe cooperation with America was possible. He hoped his choice to treat her with respect, despite having every historical and emotional reason to treat her harshly, had planted a seed that would eventually flower into something larger than one man's decision to follow his mother's wisdom about treating people right. Sergeant Carter approached. "You good, Washington?" "Yes, Sergeant. Just thinking. About whether any of this matters in the long run. Whether treating prisoners decent makes any real difference after the shooting stops." Carter was quiet for a moment, watching the dust from the convoy settle. "It matters," he said finally. "Maybe not in ways we can measure. Maybe not in ways that get written into history books. But it matters. Those women will remember. Some will tell their children. Some of those children will tell their children. And maybe, a generation from now, when someone asks why Japan and America became allies after being bitter enemies, part of the answer will trace back to moments like this, to soldiers who chose decency over revenge, who followed rules even when rules were hard, who proved that American values could be more than propaganda. I hope you are right, Sergeant. So do I, Private. So do I. The camp continued its work. More prisoners processed, more repatriations organized, more small daily demonstrations that American victory included restraint and proportion. The 93rd Regiment maintained its professional standards. Captain Morrison continued refining policies. Lieutenant Bradford continued treating patients. Corporal Nakamura continued translating between worlds. And Private James Washington continued serving breakfast to prisoners who expected execution, continued maintaining courtesy when cruelty would be easier, continued proving that his mother's simple wisdom about treating people right could become foreign policy when practiced consistently by ordinary soldiers doing their duty with integrity. Years later, when the war became history and veterans told stories, James would sometimes mention the Japanese nurse he had served breakfast to on an August morning in the Philippines. Most listeners assumed it was a minor anecdote, a small incident in a vast conflict. But James knew it was more than that. It was the moment when he had chosen what kind of man he would be, what kind of soldier he would be, what kind of American he would represent. He had chosen decency over anger, rules over revenge, his mother's values over the easier path of matching cruelty with cruelty. That choice had cost him nothing and gained him everything that mattered. His soul remained intact. His integrity survived the war. His mother's lessons proved wiser than military expedients. And somewhere in post-war Japan, a woman named Emiko Hayashi carried a memory of an American soldier who had bowed to her and offered food with both hands, proving that enemies could recognize each other's humanity even when everything conspired to deny it. That breakfast had lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Its consequences would echo for generations. If this story of humanity transcending war moved you, help us share these forgotten moments of history with others. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that challenge what we think we know about conflict, courage, and compassion. Hit that like button if you believe these lessons from the past still matter today. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think. Have you heard similar stories from your own family's history? Do you believe individual acts of decency can truly change the course of nations? Your perspective matters, and this community grows stronger when we learn from each other. The conversation doesn't end with the story. It begins in the comments section. So share your thoughts, ask questions, challenge assumptions. That's how we honor the people like Emiko and James who proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, we can choose to see each other as human beings first and enemies second. Subscribe, like, comment, and let's keep exploring the moments that shaped our world in ways the history books often overlook. See you in the next story.